Hello, I'm Ottoman Özyıldırım with the Conference Board, and welcome to the Window On program of the Conference Board, which is a monthly virtual panel on hot topics, what's going on in the economy, in the policy circles, and other related current topics. It's great to have our superb panel today, and we're going to have a discussion on recessions, which is a word that's getting bandied about. We hear a lot in the media, and we'll dig into what recessions are and how do we predict them and whether we can prevent them or not. But before I go into the topic and introduce our speakers today, just a few guidelines to make the webcast more enjoyable and efficient for you. Some of you may be joining for CPE credits, and you see the instructions there for obtaining those credits. Your live participation is necessary. There'll be 3 pop-ups at random points, which we need you to click on, and you need to enter your email address. And once again, the credit is only for live participation. In addition to that, we like to make these very interactive and conversational. And there's a pod on the bottom left corner of your screen. You can put in your questions or comments, which we'll get here in the studio, and I'll weave that into our conversation here. We really welcome your input, and we'll be asking you some questions throughout the webcast as well. You can go full screen to see the webcast. On the top right corner, there are 4 arrows, which you can, top left corner, you can click on those to make the screen full screen. At the end of the program, we have a brief evaluation. We appreciate if you could fill that out and let us know what you thought. That helps us to improve these programs. The webcast is being recorded, and it'll be on demand on our webcast in about 48 hours. You're able to come back and revisit that or share it with your colleagues at your company. In addition to that, since we don't have slides to share with you at this webcast, it's a panel discussion, we're making our Global Economic Outlook report, which just came out, available for download. So that's in the bottom center of your screen, and you'll be able to get that PDF to look at in more detail what the Conference Board's view is on the global economy. But without further ado, let me just introduce our topics here. We'll be talking about what recessions are. The media kind of latches on to this definition of 2 quarterly declines, but as economists, we take kind of a more nuanced view to that, and I think you'll be hearing about that from our panel. Now, how do you recognize that there's a recession approaching? We hear, again, a lot about the R word, but how reliable are those signals? Can recessions be prevented? And can we prepare for those recessions? Because they do create a lot of cost for businesses and the society in terms of lost output or lower employment, higher unemployment rates. So how do we prepare for that in terms of as a society and as businesses? So let me go on to introduce our panelists today. And I'll start with my colleagues here in the studio. To my immediate right is Constance Hunter. Welcome, Constance. Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, I think now.
Great to have you here. And Constance, you're a chief economist at KPMG. Tell us why you got interested in recessions.
Well, I think it's so important to find turning points. And something I've done throughout my whole career is look for inflection points in the data. So this could be a turning point that takes us in a downward direction or a turning point that takes us in an upward direction. So this naturally led to study of recessions and what causes them, what are the signals that help us determine them. And I think one of the most interesting things is how recessions are often caused by weakness combined with shocks. So then you're boiling the ocean, right? Because you're looking around the whole world and trying to figure out what are the shocks that are coming down the pike. And it's not boring. It's very exciting work.
There's a lot of complexity to work through, and you work with your leaders and your clients to kind of understand where those inflection points are. And to my far right is my colleague Gad Levanon, Vice President for Labor Markets. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. And
my pleasure.
What makes you interested in recessions?
Well, at the conference board, it's hard to avoid this topic, and I've been here for 16 years and did a lot of research on leading indicators and how to forecast recession. So happy to be here.
And you're particularly focused on labor markets, and we talked about costs of recessions, and those are very pronounced when people lose jobs.
Yeah, and after the last recession, many of them never returned to the labor market. So there is a big cost.
So major implications. Great to have you here. And joining us remotely are three panelists, and I'll go in order. So we have Kate Durney joining us from Boston, I think. Kate is an analyst at Fidelity Investments, and you work on asset allocation research. Welcome, Kate. Thank you for joining us. And tell us what you do at Fidelity.
I sit within our asset allocation group. So I cover the business cycle for the US and China and some other countries. And we really believe that it's the business cycle and economic fundamentals that drive asset market returns. So I work with portfolio managers that are deciding what to invest in at the asset class level.
Great, thank you for joining us. And those are very important perspectives in terms of investments and asset allocation, and the larger questions of resource allocations, and recessions have very big implications for that. Next is Tara Sinclair, Associate Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the George Washington University. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you. It's
great to have you here. And you're obviously interested in recessions as well, and you have another role at the George Washington University. That's the center that you're co-leading. Tell us about that.
Yes, so I run the research program on forecasting here at GW, and we are very focused on predicting recessions, also expansions. We're interested in both sides of those turning points that Constance mentioned, but I personally am passionate about learning more about how we can predict, prevent, prepare for recessions, because it's something that has an impact on so many innocent people. When the economy turns, people lose their jobs through no fault of their own, and that's something that I'm really concerned about and really want to help make policy that improves people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And those are all very, very important points. And recessions have been coming and going for, I think we can say, hundreds of years. They're a feature of market economies, and it keeps us economists busy. And they're not kind of going away. So it is important to study and see if we can predict them, which is nearly impossible to do. And last but not least is my colleague in Washington, D.C., Joe Minarik, who is Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development. Welcome, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be
and
here.
The Committee for Economic Development is the public policy arm for the Conference Board, and I thought it would be great to have you on, Joe, giving us more of that policy perspective. How do you look at recessions from the policy perspective?
Well, in my career, I've generally been more interested in long-term structural issues, but I did spend 8 years at the Office of Management and Budget during the Clinton administration. And a big part of our job was creating the twice-a-year economic forecast that was used for the purpose of budgeting. So in that context, it's extremely important to know what is going to happen to the economy, with the interesting footnote that if you are working in the White House, you can't say that a recession is possible, because if you do, people will act on that and they will make it happen. So there's a very interesting use of language to try to provide information without scaring people. So it's a form of the art that I think is extremely important, and when you're sitting in that hot seat, it keeps you busy.
Yeah, so we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies a lot, and the narrative about the economy is very important in terms of influencing confidence levels and expectations, and there's all of these feedback effects, and recessions can and do interfere with the policy and even the long-term sort of structural aspects of the economic development. So I think it'll be very interesting to hear from you later on, also in the program, to see what when we talk about whether there are policies to prevent recessions or minimize their effects. So we'll be talking more about that. But as we've been discussing, there's been more and more sort of pronouncements of the R word in the media, and we're watching that narrative unfolding very carefully. And there are risks in the both U.S. and the global economy. And we need to look at the interplay of those risks and whether they will unfold and kind of tip us into a recession or not. But before we launch into that, we thought we would ask actually our audience some questions, and I'll ask the control room to bring up a poll question for us, and we'll get some feedback from our audience to start talking about what recessions are. So the question is, which of the following statements is true in your view? The global economics growth slowdown is likely to intensify in 2020, mainly because of the industrial downturn. It's likely to intensify in 2020 because of trade wars. The growth slowdown will be the main cause of a global recession in 2020. The growth slowdown will probably reach its low point by the end of 2019 and is likely to improve in 2020, or none of them are true. So we ask you to make one selection out of the multiple choice here. And so our audience is responding here. So let's see if where the consensus, there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus. So let's keep this open a little bit, a few more seconds longer. Okay. So, and we are getting some questions. I'll go to that question right after the poll question is closed. So let's, I think we can close the poll question. And I'm going to ask our panel what they think about that. But the 41%, the most responses go to global slowdown is likely to intensify because of the trade wars in 2020. That's followed by the first option, mainly the industrial downturn will be the cause of that. And followed by, will probably reach the low point by the end of 2019. And so there are 17% of people that are expecting a slight improvement. So what do you think? Anything surprising there, Constance?
So one of the other hats I wear is as the president of the National Association for Business Economics, and a recent survey that we conducted showed similar results, that the largest single response for weakness in the US and global economy was surrounding trade tensions. And of course, there's an interplay between manufacturing and trade tensions, right? Manufacturing is normally a volatile part of the economy. We've had downturns throughout this expansion, right? We had 11 and 12, we had a downturn mostly centered in Europe, and that didn't lead to a recession in the US. And then in 2015, 2016, we had a downturn in China that spread out into the rest of the world that caused a significant fall in commodity prices. And if you recall, the Fed actually waited to start increasing rates. They were going to increase them in September of 2015. They waited until December because of that uncertainty within the global economy and within the manufacturing cycle. And now here we are with the Fed having cut 3 times this year to try to assist that manufacturing sector. And I would say the trade tensions are sort of the nail in the coffin, right? It certainly doesn't help if you're in the midst of manufacturing weakness to have increasing trade tensions. But I think it's important to recognize that this started in China because of China's liquidity cycle. It did not start because of the trade tensions. Right.
So the global aspect is very important. And let's go to Kate. You study the global business cycle. What are your reactions to this question and the responses?
So I am a little surprised by the responses, just because in the investment community, there's been a lot of excitement about global economy potentially bottoming out and improving, and there's a lot of expectation for a trade deal. That being said, I agree with the concerns that the respondents have. Global manufacturing, we think, is an extremely good leading indicator of the global business cycle, and global manufacturing activity has, of course, declined very meaningfully in the last year and a half. And I would agree with Constance that this began and emanated from China, where the deleveraging campaign and policy caused the slowdown there, and we're now feeling it in the rest of the world. That being said, I will acknowledge that many of these, the world's largest economies, do have strong, large services and consumer sectors that thus far have been pretty resilient and that we're watching very closely. And as Constance mentioned, many of the world's largest central banks, nearly all of them, have eased policy and cut interest rates this year. So that's to say that we should pay a lot of attention to the signal we're getting from manufacturing and the damage that trade is causing and can continue to cause. But in the whole picture, it's still uncertain whether this will cause a broader global downturn from
thanks,
here.
Kate. And let's go to Tara. Are you surprised at the results?
Not really, both because I've seen the NABE survey and also because it pretty much fits my weighting on these different aspects. I'm definitely worried that the trade aspect is something that is a bit of a self-inflicted wound, where we have other aspects that might just be leading to a slowdown, whereas we can be worried about being tipped over the edge by some poor policy. But overall, I think the weights pretty much match exactly how I'm kind of thinking about 2020. There's still a reasonable amount of optimism for me that things might actually look better in 2020. But every day we're watching the news about what the latest trade plans are. Obviously, keeping a very close eye on the data on manufacturing as a clear leading indicator of what's to come.
It's interesting the way that you talk about as putting different weights, and I think that clearly shows that there are different elements and there's truth in all of them, but you kind of put different sort of weighting on those causes. So, when we invited 5 economists to this panel, I was worried that we were not going to have any one-handed economists, and there seems to be some consensus kind of coming out. And Gad usually disagrees. I'm going to ask Gad what you see is surprising in this.
Okay, if someone has to disagree, then I guess I can take this job. I was surprised a little that only 17% saw an improvement. I would say, I'm not sure there will be improvement, but I think I would probably say 50-50 that there will be an improvement in the next year, a mild improvement. So the fact that only 17% shows that is a little surprising to me.
Thank you. And Joe, anything surprising there for you?
I wouldn't say surprising, but the striking thing about not only the poll results, but also all the comments that we've heard from the panelists, is the extent to which our problems are really self-inflicted. Speaking there not just for the United States, but also for other countries around the world. As an example, China, a largely state-driven economy, was weak a while ago because they had overextended credit and needed to pull back. The United States has caused a great deal of anxiety and instability by its trade policies. In Europe, we have the concern about dislocation as a result of Brexit. In all of these developments, you have countries moving in fits and starts and seeing problems, reacting to them, backtracking, reacting again. That, to me, is the really striking thing about our current situation. And what's worrying is that governments are not in any plain and transparent way cleaning up their collective act.
So let's stay with you, Joe, because there is a question here from our audience, and you brought up the self-fulfilling prophecies. Do you think that there is some truth to the statement? Tell people a recession is coming, and they will prepare for it, and thus making the recession happen, especially if told by experts. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that's definitely true. We're going to be talking about how individual actors in the economy might prepare for recession. And typically the way people prepare is to cut back on consumption, postpone investment plans, try to maintain their flexibility to the greatest degree they can. And that means not making the kinds of financial commitments that keep the economy growing. I mentioned earlier, and I'll repeat it and I hope reinforce it a little, experts, particularly folks in government, one of the things that people expect of government when they hear someone from the executive branch, the Federal Reserve, whatever, speaking about the state of the economy and economic indicators, they assume that people from government know more than rank and file citizens do. We don't. We get the information, the data that are released typically within 12 hours of when those data become public. But if people believe any statements of concern coming from the public sector, they will tend to hold back on commitments, hold back on spending, and collectively the result of that does in fact weaken the economy. It is a matter potentially of considerable concern.
So does anybody want to react to that, Constance?
So I don't disagree with what Joe said, but I want to point out that in the lead up to both the 2001 recession with regard to the dot-com bubble bursting and the lead up to the 08-09 recession, the predominant view was that people weren't expecting a recession, right? Nobody in housing wanted to believe that housing would ever go down, let alone go down sufficiently enough and reverberate sufficiently enough to cause a massive global financial crisis, right? If we look at the lead up to the dot-com bubble bursting, right, the Fed was raising rates. And if you were investing at that time and saying to people, well, you know, Intel and Cisco are probably more rate sensitive than most in the market, realize, oh, no, it's a totally new paradigm, it's a new economy, they're not rate sensitive, and yet people weren't expecting them, yet we got these recessions. Now, you could say they were induced by the Fed because they were both on the heels of a Fed rate hiking cycle. Or one could possibly make that argument, or one could make the argument that there was too much leverage, there were imbalances in the system. So yes, certainly animal spirits play a huge role, and people's expectations inform their behavior. But that if we were to have everybody, happy and optimistic, and if their future expectations were higher than their current expectations, would we never have a recession? I don't know that that's the inverse of that is correct. And so sometimes in preparation, perhaps it could, in fact, lessen the damage of a recession. If people had had more precautionary savings, for example, going into the financial crisis, we would have maybe come out of that faster. It would have been less deep. So I'm not 100% sure that this, over the course of a business cycle, can A, prevent it, and B, is altogether bad.
So expectations are part of the picture, but they're not the only thing, because there are other forces which I think we'll get into. But in terms of expectations, we've seen that consumer confidence and consumer expectations has historical highs. There's volatility, but they remain very high, consistent with continuing consumer spending.
Sure, but you need to take current expectations minus future expectations to get a gauge of whether or not a recession is coming.
Yeah. Nevertheless, business executives are much more pessimistic. So, even though consumers are doing okay, despite what you said, we see, holiday spending plans continuing, and most projections for next year for consumer spending are doing okay. But business executives are very pessimistic, and that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit as well. So maybe I'll go to Tara. Why do you think business leaders are so pessimistic? There's a big divergence between consumers and and businesses in terms of expectations?
Yeah, well, and that one's really interesting because in a lot of our economic forecasting models, we tend to think about businesses really being quite focused on their consumers' expectations. And so we tend to think about the consumer leading that cycle, that it's the consumer that has the animal spirits shift, which then leads business to cut back on investment because they're concerned they won't have buyers. But this pattern looks a little bit different. And so I'd actually love to hear some of the other panelists who are looking at it from the business perspective, where that is coming from, because that does seem like a slightly different pattern, and that also impacts our ability to potentially anticipate the next recession.
Dad?
Well, I think there are two main reasons why businesses are more pessimistic than consumers. One is that a lot of business people in the US are managing multinational companies, and they're impacted not just by what's happening in the US, but what's happening elsewhere. And in the last year or two, the US is doing better than the rest of the world on average. So that's one reason. The second is that corporate profits are under pressure. They're actually on a downward trend. Partly because of the tight labor market and the accelerating labor cost. So that accelerating labor cost is good for consumers because they have more to consume with, but for businesses, that reduces their profit. So that's another reason why you see more optimism among consumers than businesses.
Here's a comment from one of our viewers that's interesting because should U.S. business leaders continue interpreting the slowdown in domestic business investment growth as a negative risk to the economy, or the natural outcome of a record low unemployment and very healthy job market? So is this kind of the way things are now, and we shouldn't really interpret the low business investment, business spending growth as a very negative risk? Anybody wants to react to that? Is it kind of part of the new normal, Gat?
Well, I think typically business investment tends to react to a slowdown in the economy and a slowdown in expectations for the future. And we had very strong growth in 2018 and a burst of investment in that year, and I think some people thought that 3% is something that could last for several years, and when it turned out that it's not the case, that we are back to the 2% environment, and I think also many actors, market actors and business people lowered their expectation for the future. Then you need less capacity, and as a result, businesses are spending less on investment. I think this is the main reason. I mean, there are also an increasing risk, but it's hard for me to remember a time in the last 3-4 years when there wasn't a lot of risk in the economy. So I think that the main determinant of business investment is just how optimistic and what businesses think their capacity should be in the next several years.
And they're not expecting much, so this is kind of something we should get used to.
But throughout this cycle, we've had business investment that's below the previous expansion that mirrors this expansion, which was the 1990s expansion. Now, this one obviously has exceeded it, but if we compare business investment in this expansion versus that one, it's been a chronic state of underinvestment. So I think it's possible that there might be something deeper going on, either in terms of the perception of inflation or in the perception of long-term growth, long-term potential GDP. I think those are interacting.
That's a good point too. So there are a lot of these complex feedback mechanisms and interactions between the short term and the long term. I think I will direct a question to Tara, kind of pick up on that investment side. So you work with a lot of forecast models. What is the role of investment in these models? And what do the models say about the right level of investment going forward?
Well, I mean, I think it's great that you brought up this long run versus short run interaction, because I think that's really key. And one of the things that I'm actually surprised about with the description of the labor market being pretty tight is that we might think that this would be a time when companies would be investing in new technologies in order for them to do some labor replacement if it's really becoming harder for them to fill roles. And we perhaps we're starting to see that and make that argument last year, but then this year it doesn't look like that's what's happening. And the problem is that if that's not happening today, then we won't have those technologies to boost the long run growth rate later. So there is that feedback that's happening where a lack of investment today might be reducing long run growth. And so it's an unfortunate feedback that if we are already seeing companies being pessimistic about the long run and therefore they're not investing, that might be also another form of self-fulfilling behavior.
That's interesting. But if the long run growth rates are kind of coming down because of lower investment and other factors, it makes it a little bit easier to tip into recession because you're closer to zero. So if things are not going so well, or if you're hit by a shock, you could kind of tip the economy into a contraction. So it is important to try to recognize these turning points. But how do we do that? So before we go into kind of preventing or preparing for recessions, I'm going to ask about, what do you do to predict recession? So let's start with you, Constance. Do you think there are signs of recession, and what signals do you look at?
Yeah, so I have a list. So number one on my list is the yield curve. And the way I explain this to people is it's sort of like taking the temperature of the economy. So if you use a thermometer and you take your temperature and you see you have a fever, you know something's wrong, right? But you aren't quite sure. Do you have bronchitis? Do you maybe have the flu? Do you have a virus? Do you have strep throat? You need to go then do further tests. But it's an indicator that you're not well and you need to do something to get better, right? It also impacts liquidity conditions, right? Because banks, there was a survey the Fed does in its senior loan officer survey, and they asked a special question last year around this time: will you tighten liquidity conditions if the yield curve inverts slightly? And so 40% of banks said they would tighten liquidity conditions for commercial real estate, and 19% of banks said they would tighten for commercial and industrial loans. So it impacts liquidity conditions, but it's also an indicator that something is wrong. So then if we dig deeper, we look at things like housing. Now, until this most recent quarter, we had 6 consecutive quarters of negative residential housing investment. It has turned around. But if we go back to previous recessions, for example, the 2001 recession, we saw housing was weak, and then it turned around for several quarters before the recession actually hit. So it's a good sign that it's turned around. It's probably the result of the Fed's recent activity and lowering mortgage rates, but it's not a sure thing that we're going to be out of the woods. And then there's a bunch of other things we look at, sort of what's going on in the high yield market. So what's going on in the CAA credit. Those yields are going back up. They're not quite as high as they were at the beginning of this year, but those yields are rising. BAA credit is another place to look. What are those spreads doing? Those are much better than they were at the beginning of the year, but I look at that CAA and I get a little concerned. We look at manufacturing new orders. We look at things like consumer confidence, but not just confidence, but confidence minus future expectations and what's going on with that spread. And then finally, of course, the equity market, which gives lots of false signals, but is still important to look at.
So there are a lot of indicators out there and lots of information, and it's not always easy to kind of distill that. And, so going around, Gad, do you have a favorite indicator?
Yeah, so exactly to this point, there are many indicators. Some of them are giving the right signal in a given recession, some do not. So I think my favorite indicator is the Conference Board Leading Economic Index, which aggregates what we think are the 10 best or among the 10 best leading indicators.
That's an objective view, right?
It's a very objective view, and then when you average 10 indicators, they are more likely to give you the right signal and remove the noise from that. So if you had to ask me what single indicator I like the most, I would say as someone who does a lot of work in the labor markets, is the number of workers in the temp help industry. This has proven to be a very reliable leading indicator of employment and of recessions, because when things are starting to look shaky, companies will first let go of their temp help workers before they touch their regular employees. So that's a good indicator.
Great, thank you. So let's go online. And Kate, let me start with you. Also looking at the global business cycle, do you have any favorite indicators?
I do. I also have a lot of favorites like the other folks. And I would just say we take a little bit of a different approach for the US. So we actually split the expansionary period into early cycle, mid-cycle, and late cycle, and then we have a recession. So we have models that estimate the probability of being in each of those phases. And so that helps us because when we have a really high and persistent probability of late cycle, we know that the likelihood that recession is on the horizon is much higher, and we want to be more cautious because sometimes recessions can come very quickly and be difficult to predict. So some of our favorite indicators for the late cycle period would be things like corporate profit margins, because we think that the profit cycle coming under pressure is what triggers layoffs, which can turn the cycle. And then for recession, overall we love to use survey data and data that don't get revised as often, because that helps us make investment decisions in real time. Many times the market reacts to the first print, not the third or fourth revision. And so we like to use things like initial unemployment claims. We like many of the Conference Board surveys that have been discussed, so the present situation index, expectations. We really do like the yield curve because we think it matters a lot for the incentive structure of the banks, and we think it tells you a really important signal about the willingness for banks to make new loans and therefore the outlook for the credit cycle more broadly. So those are a bunch of different ones, but I think those would cover our favorites.
I think you're beginning to see why economists don't have just one arm, right? There's so much data out there, and sometimes they're giving mixed signals. And some are positive, some are negative. And let me go to Joe. What do you think, what do you make of it when the signals are mixed? So you've been tracking the US economy for a long time, and how do you interpret those mixed signals when you're thinking about recession risk?
Well, right now, it's a pretty typical situation. At this moment, the economy has indicators pushing up and pushing down. And it tells you that we are on a relatively balanced path. The economy is growing more or less at its capacity, 2% plus or minus. And as a result, that begins to fall into a pattern. When you start to see the indicators shifting in terms of a stronger balance, either up or down, and usually you're looking after a period of expansion, you're looking for down rather than up. It's when you start to see the confluence of indicators changing that you begin to think that something is going negative. And, in terms of the indicators that would be pushing in that way, I'm a kind of a meat and potatoes guy. If you start to see layoffs showing up in the unemployment insurance figures every week, that's beginning to tell you that you're going to start to see a cautious consumer, and as a result of that, a cautious business investor, and that is what begins to get the cycle rolling downhill.
Thanks, Joe. So in this segment of predicting recessions, let me ask the last question to Tara. Can we reliably predict recessions or not? What do you think?
I'm so glad that I get the last word on this because we could fight about this for a long time. But a lot of the research that has come out of our research program on forecasting really emphasizes that in evaluating past forecasts, there doesn't seem to be anybody who has a clear record of being able to predict recessions in advance. That includes even the top forecasters of the U.S. economy, such as the Federal Reserve Board staff. And we can talk about a lot of reasons why that might be happening, but I think this is where we turn towards at least focusing on indicators that tell us that we are in a recession. We may not be able to predict it, but even knowing that we are in a recession in real time is already quite informative for decision making, and is definitely better than waiting until the NBER, which is the official arbiter of their business cycle dating committees, who tells us when the U.S. is in a recession. They often take up to a year or more after a recession has begun to tell us that the recession has started. But there are indicators that tell us that faster. And so I want to do a shout out to Claudia Saum's SAUM rule, looking at changes in the unemployment rate as being an indicator of being in a recession that might be useful for policymakers and other decision makers.
So it really is more than reading the tea leaves. By evaluating a lot of various indicators and studying the economy, we can gauge better whether we are getting inflection points or not. But the reliability of that can still be improved, of course. As a segue to our next section about preventing recessions, I want to read a comment that came in. And we were discussing this before we started the program too. So the comment says, I wonder if recessions should be prevented at all. Evidence suggests that recessions are of shorter duration if public policymakers stay out of the way, allowing private actors to adjust and make changes quickly and more efficiently. So there is a sense that recessions kind of clear the market and allow for unsuccessful firms to go out of the way and improve efficiency and resource allocation. So they are kind of a healthy process of the economy. So I thought that was a good comment for us to talk about, can recessions be prevented? Before we do that, we're going to go to another poll question. So if the control room can put the poll question up. We're going to ask about policy instruments that can prevent recessions. And what is the most important policy instrument to prevent a recession? We have a series of policy actions. And in this case, you can actually select more than one. Infrastructure spending, business and personal tax cuts, management of government debt, including local and state as well as federal, easing lending rates, interest rates, targeted industrial policy, or others. So let's see if people have some favorite policy measures. We'll keep the poll open a few more seconds. All right, let's close the poll in about 1, 2, 3. So interestingly, the most favored, the majority seems to go to infrastructure spending as a way to prevent recessions. Next, actually, we're kind of going down the list, right? Easing lending rates. So interest rates is going to be sort of the next favorite way to prevent recessions. That's followed by business and personal tax cuts. I'm surprised actually tax cuts don't come out at the top because they get a lot of media attention, right, when they come around. And then managing debt is the fourth there. And industrial policy, I wasn't really expecting a lot of responses for that from a US audience, but perhaps we have some global viewers too. So about 28% go to industrial policy as a way to prevent recession. So a very quick sort of round robin, any surprises there, and what do you think? Let's go online first this time. So I'll start with Joe. Any policy surprises there?
Well, if you're talking to a friend and you're saying that it's very hard to get something accomplished, you might say, well, gee, it would take an act of Congress to get Harry down the road to mow his lawn. If infrastructure spending is a solution to an impending recession, it would take an act of Congress to make it happen. I tend to be rather skeptical of waiting for policymakers, for elected policymakers actually to make those kinds of decisions. The ideal first responder I would hold would be the Federal Reserve. They can schedule a conference call. They can act within 24 hours, and not only that, they consider it to be a part of their remit that when the time comes to reverse that policy of stimulus, they take the punch bowl away. If situations become extreme, then for sure the Federal Reserve takes interest rates down to virtually zero, and it's still not enough. Then you need an act of Congress. But I would typically not ask for an act of Congress as the first step in the process.
And they have done those conference calls, so we do know that they can act very, very quickly at the Fed. So Tara, what do you think? Any surprises to you in terms of policy instruments to prevent recessions?
Well, following on Joe's comments, it is really amazing. Historically, I think easing lending rates, that was what we all really thought was the best way to have a policy reaction to recessions, up until we found ourselves still here in a situation where interest rates, not just in the US, but globally, have remained low for so long that all of a sudden we're now quite concerned that we might really need to be thinking about other forms of policy because there may not be as much traditional ammunition anymore. And so I think that's where everybody's hearing about this broader mix. One thing that's not on this poll, and that might help with this active Congress issue, is automatic stabilizers. If we had, if we took action now and built in more automatic stabilizers into our economy, so that when the next recession comes in, then it doesn't take an act of Congress to key on more infrastructure spending or tax cuts or funding to individual households. That might also be a way to help
Thanks,
here.
Tara. And Kate?
So I would disagree a little bit with the poll. So we have found that things like infrastructure spending and fiscal policy more generally is more effective when you're already in recession. So for example, we found for every dollar of fiscal stimulus, the multiplier is 3 times as high when the economy is in recession and the Fed is acting in the same direction as fiscal policy, rather than if you're before a recession happens and maybe the economy is still pretty close to full employment or the Fed has normalized policy. So I would say things like infrastructure, maybe tax cuts work well when you're already in a recessionary environment. I don't know how well how good that would do at preventing a recession. I think that for preventing a recession, the best thing to do would, if possible, be to prevent over-tightening. I think I believe that that credit tightening really is the catalyst for an end of cycle. So to the extent that money is not made too tight and lending rates are well behaved, I think that's really, really key to preventing a recession, especially in the US, given that we have the dollar and so many countries around the world borrow in dollars. Right. I think that keeping a decent rate of money growth is really key to preventing a credit crunch and then a downturn.
Right. Thank you, Kate. I think we keep coming back to this issue of timing. Timing is very important, and that's kind of, it's involved in sort of the, when do you time the policy response ahead of the recession or after the recession, and then the recession timing itself is also a challenge too. So in the studio, Gad, about policy effectiveness.
Yeah, no, I think Kate's point about the difference between using some of those tools before a recession and during a recession is a very good one. I don't think we should implement radical changes to our government policy just because we may enter a recession, because one could always argue that we're about to enter a recession, and then if it's a very easy thing to justify if we choose that way. So I would also prefer to leave those two cases where we're obviously in a recession. I think the Federal Reserve is probably the main thing that we should rely on before recessions actually happen in order to prevent it.
First line of defense.
Yeah.
But then, of course, there are debates about the effectiveness of monetary policy too, but we might have to leave that to another webcast. We do have to move on. Last but not least, on this question about preventing recessions with policy, Constance, what do you think?
Yeah, so I tend to agree with Kate with regard to this, that monetary policy is most effective. And she brought up a couple of points that I want to underscore. One is that dollar liquidity is so important for the global economy, not just the US economy. So the majority of world trade, not just commodities, occurs in dollars. And so we see a really significant impact on the global liquidity. Lots of central banks were able to lower interest rates after the Fed started this recent mid-cycle adjustment. And that helped global liquidity. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which ties into a question we got about birth rates and long-term demographic challenges. So this challenge of lower birth rates and increasing longevity, I think, is a larger structural problem that could be addressed more with fiscal policy than monetary policy. And of course, these things intersect during the business cycle. So right now, for example, with a 3.5% unemployment rate, we're not adding as many jobs each month because there just aren't as many new workers. There's still some slack, but if we get down to the point where we're only adding at the growth rate of the population, right, that's a governor on how fast we can grow. So thinking about policies, and I think for infrastructure, there's a reason it was so popular, because everybody recognizes that when you have a deficit of corporate investment and you need to rely on productivity for your long-term growth, you have to have investment from some other place, and government smart infrastructure investment can help improve productivity down the road. So I think that's why it was such a popular answer.
So that can really change the mood about the future expectations because there's so much more spending going to infrastructure. So let me follow up with sort of, what would you need to see to improve the outlook? So what would improve the outlook expectations of investors and business leaders, in your view?
Oh, well, I think having higher productivity, sustained higher productivity, which could be the result of technological innovation combined with investment, right? So it depends on if we get lucky with the technological cycle. I think certainly the amount of federal debt is something that when I go out and I speak to CEOs and business leaders, it's something that weighs on their mind a little bit. It concerns them that either their personal taxes or their corporate taxes are at some point going to need to go up as a result of the level of debt and just sort of being aware of the crowding out that could occur. So I think stabilizing our fiscal balances and then thinking about our infrastructure investment could be things that, from a policy perspective, could help the long-run outlook.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked about recognizing recessions and seeing if we can prevent recessions, but let's now spend a little bit of time talking about whether we can prepare our businesses for recession. They are, in many cases, inevitable. We don't always know how severe they will be, but they do come and go. Let's open the poll question, if the control room could do that, and start with a question to our audience. What do you believe is the best way to prepare your business for a recession? And we've got some options there. You can also type them additional comments in if you'd like. To prepare your business for a recession, you can make contingency plans to downsize when you get a downturn in sales and profits. You can invest in a rainy day fund. You can invest in long-term growth by enhancing your productivity through digital transformation that might make your business more resilient and more prepared. Also, contingency plans to shift your operations to less costly locations or expand into growth markets to diversify your operations. And then there could be other, and in this case also you can pick more than one. We'll give you a few more seconds as we're running low on time. Let's see. Maybe 5 more seconds as people make up their minds or go through these pretty complex issues. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and let's close the poll and look at the results here. So investing in long-term growth gets the highest, and sort of I think that's personally I think that's a smart thing to do. You know, if you have a resilient, strong foundation for your business, it is easier to kind of to overcome the effects of the recession. And then the other high options, the votes go to expanding into growth markets, diversifying sources of revenues, and making contingency plans to downsize. That's followed by rainy day funds, lower, and then much lower, a few people picking contingency plans to shift operations, and also some other things that people are thinking about. So we have a few minutes remaining, and we'll do a quick roundabout. So Constance, any surprises to those?
So we're actually about to publish a document on this very subject. What can companies do to prepare for a recession? And of course, focusing on, because you never know the exact timing, focusing on things that will be accretive whether or not a recession comes along is really important. And so I would agree with all these. I would add sort of one thing would be making sure that you have ample credit or securing credit lines before a recession comes. And that maybe is a subset of the rainy day fund, but certainly something that is really prudent to do ahead of the time when banks are going to be tightening their liquidity conditions.
Yeah. And Gad, any surprises?
Not really. I just maybe a comment rather than an opinion about the survey is, I think the magnitude of the recession is also important, and I think the most executives or in the last 17, 18 years experienced only one recession, and it was a gigantic one. And it's, I think, important to remember that this was an unusual recession, and most recessions are much milder and less damaging. And I think in the case of a normal recession, the impact on a company is much smaller, and it's much more likely to kind of continue, not as business as usual, but without drastically changing the course of the company.
Right, so recessions have been getting shorter and milder since the 80s, with the exception of 2008, and there's no guarantee the next one is going to be as deep as 2008, 2009, and it's hard to predict those even after you enter the recession. The recession starts with a slowdown, but it could get worse, or it could end abruptly as well. So those
well, certainly in 08, we saw dramatic credit contraction, which I think foreshadowed the breadth and severity that recession was going to result in.
Yeah. So online, 30 seconds each. Joe, what do you think?
Well, I just enunciate 2 principles. One would be you do not want to take irreversible decisions that you're doing merely because of a possible temporary recession. The second thing is there may be some wise decisions for the long term where at the outset of a recession is not the best time to do them. So you want to be careful about fitting your solution to the situation at the time.
Thanks, Joe. And Kate, how about you? What do you think about preparation?
So I agree that enhancing productivity and things like diversifying your revenue sources are great long-term strategies. I also think in a shorter term, because it's good for a company to not build up too much excess capacity. So So not hire too many extra workers, maintain a decently high capacity utilization, and then I would also say on the credit side, especially now with such low rates, terming out debt can be really advantageous so that if you do enter a downturn or credit does tighten, you're not worried about rolling over extremely short-term debt, and you have a little bit more leeway there.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Tara, what do you think about preparing your business or your organization for recessions?
Well, I think the key thing is to not have the kind of business plans that require clear forecasts of timing of an arrival of a recession. If that's what if you're trying to time things that closely, then you're not going to get that information. So coming up with one of these more robust plans is a great way to be prepared no matter what happens.
Great, thank you very much. And we are at the end of the hour, so unfortunately it's great discussion, but I have to close the webcast. I want to thank our audience and those of you that sent in your questions and comments. If we haven't addressed all of them, feel free to get back in touch with us, and we can kind of continue that conversation. Next month and next year, the Windows On webcast series is going to continue. It's hosted by our chief economist, Bart Van Ark. And look out for the topics that will be coming out. And if you have suggestions for topics, feel free to send those in. When we close, we'll have a very brief evaluation, so we would appreciate your feedback there. I want to thank our panelists who joined today to discuss recession risk, prevention, and preparedness. So I really appreciate you joining us, and great discussion. Thank you very much. Online, we have Joe Minarik, Kate, and Tara, and in the studio here with me, Gad Lebanon and Constance Hunter. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.